So hello, everyone. Welcome to the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights second webinar of the fall 2021 pre-session roundup. And we're delighted to have you. I am Nina Beth Carden, as many of you know, the director of the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights. And I'm delighted to be here with Claire Miller, who is our communications specialist and director, and Deb Harris, who is our volunteer coordinator. As you know, we are committed to putting in the Declaration of Rights of Maryland State Constitution and an amendment that says that everyone has a right to a healthful environment. And we are especially privileged to be guided in some of our work by an extraordinary scholar and a just wonderful human with a wonderful spirit who is with us today to present on the critical issue of the connection between human dignity and environmental human rights. James May is the Distinguished Professor of Law and co-founder and co-director of the Dignity Rights Project and the Environmental Rights Institute at Widener University, Delaware Law School. I don't think that can get on one business card, Jimmy. I don't know how you get all of your credentials on a business card. He is the inaugural and immediate past Chief Sustainability Officer at Widener University, where he founded the Widener Sustainability Initiative. And Jimmy is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 15 books, including the forthcoming Encyclopedia of Human Rights and the Environment. He literally, when you say who wrote the book, he literally wrote the book on constitutional environmentalism. And he also authored and edited several books on dignity law, which he co-authored with his colleague, Erin Daly, whom we're also privileged to have with us today. It's a special treat and a surprise that Erin is joining us. Erin Daly is professor and director of the new Dignity Rights Clinic at Delaware Law School and executive director of Dignity Rights International, which she and Professor May co-founded. She's the author of Dignity Rights, Courts, Constitutions, and the Worth of the Human Person, which was first published in 2012 and is now out again in 2020. The work that the two of them do underpins the essence of environmental human rights amendments that we are working on and that others around the world and around the United States are working on. And Jimmy and Erin, we are thrilled to have you with us to help us understand how impactful environmental human rights are, in fact, on the substance of the foundation of human dignity, which of course is something that we all cherish and all desire. So with that, Jimmy, I turn the mic over to you.
So thank you, Nina, for that generous, way too generous introduction. I didn't know you were talking about it first. And I want to thank the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights for just providing this opportunity to talk about dignity and really the Maryland Environmental Rights Amendment and the role that it might play. And one other note is just that, most of my bio has been done in partnership with Erin, who's with us here today. So most of the work on environmental human rights, most of the work on dignity rights has been lockstep with Erin. So that's why I was so delighted when she was able to join us for this conversation. So thank you everyone for joining us. Here's what we're talking about. There is a conversation all around the globe, as you know, about whether there's a fundamental right to a healthy environment. And that can be reflected in international law, like it was almost 2 weeks ago on October 8th by the UN Human Rights Council, and recognizing a right to a healthy environment. Now that isn't legally binding, but it's important. It's important because it helps shine a light on the path to environmental human rights in places like the United States. At least it can help inform conversations, including those at what Erin and I call the subnational level, that is at the state level. And in the United States, environmental human rights first found their footing in 1968. A federal congressman, Richard Ottinger, proposed an amendment to the federal constitution. Yes, imagine that. An amendment to recognize everyone's right to a decent environment. And around that period of time, another junior state representative from Pennsylvania, Franklin Curry, who gave a talk a couple of weeks ago, was making a similar proposal. It wasn't, however, until 1971 that we had the first constitution anywhere in the omniverse that recognized a right to a healthy environment, and that was Illinois. But shortly thereafter, Pennsylvania, by referendum, adopted an environmental human right, or it didn't call it human right, but environmental rights and the public trust doctrine. Again, Franklin told that story. And then Montana and about a handful of other states. So by our count, about 6 states have constitutions that reflect a right to a healthy environment. And New York might become the next one next month. But what you might not know and might not be on your radar is that there has been an incredible adaptation and implementation of human dignity throughout the globe as a legal matter. Like, there are 193 UN recognized countries and more than 160, yes, 160. So most of the planet have constitutions that reflect a right to dignity. It's not the same story for environmental human rights. By my count, 83 countries have instantiated a right to a healthy environment. And of those, only about a third have those provisions in action forcing sections of the Constitution, meaning that they're enforceable. And of that third, only about half have ever even reached the light of day in a courthouse. So in 2021, only about 10 countries have issued opinions that interpret a right to a healthy environment. So you may wonder, well, where is all this action happening about climate change and biodiversity and legal personification of ecosystems? How is it happening throughout the globe? Well, what you may be surprised to hear is that it's happening through that other thing, through the right to dignity, where courts have for many years now issued thousands of opinions advancing human dignity in various contexts, gender equality, education, healthcare, childcare, and a whole variety of things, and a right to a healthy environment. So that's where courts are getting at this idea that everyone, everywhere has a right to human dignity, and everyone, everywhere, as a part of that, has a right to breathe, clean air and drink clean water and be safe in their environments. So it comes through dignity. So that's what Erin and I are talking about. If you wonder where it fits in, and where it fits in at the subnational level, like in Maryland, is that it can play an interstitial, if not a leading role in recognizing a right to everyone to a healthy environment in Maryland. Some states have done this already. Montana has a right to human dignity in its constitution, which has included environmental aspects. Puerto Rico, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico has it. But so far, it's sort of an underutilized linkage in the United States. But it's here and now, and it's important and it's impactful all across the globe. But it's a device that we could use now in the US. So that's what we'll be talking about. The basic outline of our talk is just about dignity. We'll start there. We appreciate that the right to human dignity, might not be something that a lot of people know a lot about. Erin and I collectively, and sorry to say this, Erin, but we've been teaching constitutional law for something close to 60 years between the two of us. And it's not a part of US law. But it's a huge part of law everywhere else. And it's beginning to find lots of footing in the United States. And so there's an opportunity for advancing environmental justice and environmental rights through the lens of human dignity. So we'll start there with dignity. And then we'll talk about dignity as a human right and how it underpins other human rights that are more sort of garden variety and household names. And then we'll turn finally, after the drum roll, to what it means for the environment by telling you about some cases and some constitutional provisions that draw this link between human dignity and the environment, and potentially what it means for the Maryland Environmental Rights Amendment. So that's a basic outline of where we're going. So let's start with dignity. And let me turn it over to, again, my friend and colleague, Erin Daly. Erin.
Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be here. I'm really delighted that I was able to join this conversation. So thank you to Nina for organizing it, and Claire for organizing it and for inviting me. And thanks, Jimmy, of course, for allowing me to share the stage. As Jimmy said, we've been looking at dignity rights for a really long time now. And there's this huge body, as he mentioned, of jurisprudence from around the world about dignity cases. And when you look at all the cases, there's no sort of specific definition of what we mean by dignity. But when we've looked at all the cases, we sort of see this overlapping consensus. That is, the courts aren't in lockstep, but the courts around the world are kind of saying the same thing. And there's really no courts that are inconsistent with this or that have a different view of dignity. They're all sort of drawing the same kind of picture of dignity. So what we see in the cases is that dignity has sort of four elements. One is just that dignity recognizes the worth of every human being, as Jimmy said, of every person everywhere. And that has significance, particularly for environmental conversations, because of course, if everybody now has human dignity, of course, everybody in future generations does too. And so dignity by its very nature sort of brings into the conversation the obligations of intergenerational equity. The second aspect, and this isn't really in no particular order, but just sort of the way it kind of falls logically for us, that worth that every human being has is equal. Nobody has more or less dignity than anybody else. So people have different, wealth, different opportunities, different lives, different relationships to the environment, but the human dignity that is in each one of us is equal among, sort of shared equally among all of humanity. And it is inherent. We are born with it. And that means that governments aren't granting us dignity. This isn't like a civil right that you get for being a citizen. It's just a quality that you have, a value that you have for being born. So it inheres in all of us, and it's also inalienable in that it cannot be taken away. So this is not a matter of legislative grace. And then finally, dignity is universal. It does apply to every person who is born. And we can go through the slides. I think that sort of the basic message that we want to convey in this part of the talk is just that dignity is reflected, as he said, in thousands of cases, but and in 160 constitutions, but it's also reflected in basic human rights law. So it's part of the UN Charter. The UN Charter says that the purpose of gathering the nations together to create the United Nations was, first of all, to, could you just go back for a second, Jim? Was first of all to end the scourge of war, and secondly to reflect and to protect the human dignity in all of us. And the first thing the United Nations did when it was established was create a Human Rights Commission, and now you can go forward to the next one. And then 3 years later, in 1948, the Human Rights Commission established or drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the General Assembly in 1948. And we see this language both in the preamble and in Article 1. So dignity is sort of this foundational place. And the language here is actually really very powerful, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, that dignity, recognition of that dignity is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So it's really important to the whole human rights enterprise. And so you can see it's reflected in Article 1, but also in the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's also reflected in the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Convention Against Torture, et cetera, et cetera. And most recently, the Human Rights Committee articulated this general comment where they said that the right to life itself is the right to live with dignity, that you cannot have a meaningful right to life without thinking about how people are living. So go on. We also see it at the regional, and there's way too much text here, but just to sort of give you an idea of just how pervasive recognition of dignity is as a foundation of law and as a foundation of justice, of all kinds of justice. So it's in the American Declaration, it's in the African Charter of Humans and People's Rights, it's in the European Union, in different ways in the European Convention implicitly, and in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and also in the ASEAN Charter. And we also see it in domestic constitutions. And the next two slides are really just to give you a sense of how dignity looks when it is in the constitutions of different countries. So you just see sort of this different language, and you can just skip ahead. And what happens when it's in the constitutions is that it then gets interpreted in constitutional law. And again, if you look at, this is two examples of how it shows up in US constitutional law. But if you look at the constitutional law globally, these thousands of cases really kind of fall into three basic categories. One is that there are cases about, as we just saw at the Human Rights Commission, about the right to live with dignity. And then the second one is the right to be treated with dignity. And a third category is the right to assert one's dignity, the right to sort of build one's personality and one's identity and flourish in that way. And it's that first category, the right to live with dignity, that we just saw is recognized at the international level also, that I think is sort of most significant for to see the connection between environmental rights and dignity rights. Jimmy, do you want to talk about some of those cases?
Sure. Thank you, Erin. That was terrific. So what we just learned from that overview of dignity under law is just how important it is. Again, I honestly, I didn't realize it when I started teaching constitutional law, even litigating it. I didn't understand or appreciate the legal underpinnings of human dignity in various contexts, in how we see it in international law and regional agreements and all these constitutions, and that expressed in the three areas that Erin just mentioned. I also didn't know this one, the extent to which dignity has been used to advance human rights all around the globe, and more so at the subnational level, including potentially in the United States, including in Maryland. So just first, that courts have taken notice of dignity all throughout the globe. They're comfortable with the idea of enforcing a right to human dignity, because the right to human dignity has been recognized for 70 years. It was a couple of years ago that the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights celebrated its 70th birthday on December 10th of 2018. So it's got some years on it. Courts feel fairly comfortable enforcing it, and we see that in environmental contexts. We see it not just in courts, but also the very fundamental document about the environment on the international stage, and that's the Stockholm Declaration. Remember that one from 1972? Did you realize that the preamble and the basis of that Stockholm Declaration is promoting human dignity? You can see the language on the slide in front of you, that the idea is to promote freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in the environment, an environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. So that's this connection between the right to healthy environment and dignity. And then we see it in jurisprudence from courts all around the globe. This one remark from the Supreme Court of Nepal sort of says it all, doesn't it? That it cannot be imagined to live with dignity in a polluted environment. And so we see what courts then have done with that, and what the international community has done with it. So you're probably pretty familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, from the United Nations. And what you may not realize, I didn't realize, even after dealing with and studying and teaching sustainability for a long time, is the extent to which dignity is infused there too. So if you're looking for the linkages between what you're doing locally in Maryland and what's happening internationally, that bridge, again, is dignity. That the Sustainable Development Goals are really designed to promote human dignity. I mean, not a clean environment. That's not the purpose of the Sustainable Development Goals. Their purpose is to promote human dignity by having a sustainable environment. And then, what to do with this this linkage between dignity and a right to a healthy environment? There's still a lot of work to be done. And one of the earliest cases that took on that work was from Nigeria, where a federal high court judge ordered Shell, one of the largest multinational corporations on the planet, to stop flaring natural gas because it was hurting farmers and communities and children and cattle in the communities in and around the Niger Delta. So it ordered Shell to stop. Who has done that? It wasn't done again for another 30 years until fairly recently, right? But this one judge ordered Shell to stop, and it was on the basis of a constitutional right to dignity in the Nigerian constitution, not on the right to a healthy environment. Dignity also finds its ways into these new and pressing areas of global concern, the climate crisis. As you know, the Paris Climate Accord isn't enforceable. It doesn't have enforceable attributes to it. And most nations don't have enforceable laws about the climate. So, some do. There are 8 countries that address the climate and climate change in their constitutions. Of course, the US is not among them. And in the US, we don't have a climate change law at the federal level. But did you know that some countries have turned to the right to dignity to order their governments to develop climate action plans? Leading the way there is Pakistan and the Lahore High Court, which ordered the government to come up with a climate action plan and develop a standing committee on climate, which it did, as part of how they're achieving their climate goals. But that's not all. Recent case, this is the Neubauer case out of Germany. You may have heard about just over the summer. It's based on dignity. So the German Constitution, the basic law of Germany, the very first provision and the foundation of that constitution is to promote human dignity. So all laws in Germany are interpreted through that lens. Constitutional cases are interpreted through the lens of human dignity, including the case over the summer, again, ordering action on the climate. That's not based upon a right to a healthy environment. That's through dignity.
Can I just jump in on that case? If you can just go back to that slide. I just want to point out sort of what you've seen, and this is just to reinforce what you're already seeing and what Jimmy said. But in Germany, they have defined one of the ways in which they think about dignity is in terms of this question of the quality of life and how people live. In Latin America, they'll refer to la vida digna, this notion that people should not only live as in be alive, but have a certain quality of life. And in Germany, it's referred to as this minimum subsistence level, the minimum that you need in your pension or in your income or whatever, the basic needs to allow a person to live with dignity. And they've had for many years this longstanding jurisprudence about living with dignity in terms of this minimum subsistence level. And what they've done in March is just sort of add this notion of ecological minimum subsistence. And just you see the sort of the seamlessness with which these courts are integrating already developed notions of living with dignity and then integrating the environment into that and saying, well, part of living with dignity is not just having a roof over your head and having adequate education or healthcare or adequate food, but it's also living in an ecologically sound environment. And so what you see is just sort of, as I say, like the seamlessness of it, that these are so well integrated.
Absolutely, and that integration is manifested in other adjudicative bodies like the Human Rights Committee. So the Human Rights Committee is like a court in Geneva that rules on human rights matters, as the name suggests. The US isn't a part of it, but it hears claims about violations of human rights. And recently it's taken on this question as to whether climate refugees are entitled to certain kinds of human rights. And in deciding, what kinds of obligations countries have when the climate crisis results in displacement of human beings, their families and friends and loved ones. And so the Human Rights Committee took this on a few years ago and issued an opinion recently where it said, really what we're talking about is protecting and advancing, you got it, right? Human dignity. So that's the way to square the circle, or circle the square, I guess it's square the circle of human right to dignity in the Anthropocene. As a programming note, in case you're wondering, if you'll have a chance for questions and conversation, there will be. We'll wrap here within 10 minutes. We've timed this for 30 minutes, so just in case you're wondering about that. And then also there are issues of intergenerational equity and the role of dignity. And Erin, I wouldn't mind if you talk about this one, given the work that you've done in this field with Justice Shaw. Thank you.
So one of the interesting things about this sort of global scan of dignity jurisprudence and environmental jurisprudence, and sort of looking at the places where they overlap, is that it is happening all over the world. It is happening in jurisdictions in every region of the world, Europe, Latin America, Africa. There's countries in every region of the world where the courts are really sort of taking ownership of this. You might have seen a lot of cases recently from Ecuador and Colombia. Their court has been very active, both in dignity issues and in environmental issues. The European Court of Justice, as we just saw from Germany, also South Africa, also very, very strong jurisprudence and strong environmental jurisprudence. So we're seeing this happen in a lot of places, and some of the places, frankly, may be a bit surprising. So, and it really depends on whether there's a judge or more than one judge who kind of who sees it, who gets it. And in Pakistan, if you'll just go, in Pakistan, there are a few judges. One of them is the justice named here, Mansur Ali Shah, who sits on the Supreme Court of Pakistan. He was the one who decided the climate justice cases that Jimmy referred to before. And one of the things I always think is interesting about this is that when he was on the Lahore High Court, he took this very, very active role in establishing a climate justice committee, in requiring the government to establish this climate justice committee. And whereas in some countries that might be seen as an impeachable offense, he immediately got elevated to the country Supreme Court for decisions like that. So judges around the world, including some in the US, are really sort of starting to step in and say, recognize that we need to fix the climate crisis and the environmental crisis. And they're doing it whether or not there is clear language in the Constitution that encourages that. And we just wanted you to see this. This is actually an administrative, it's what we would call an administrative law case. It had to do with the issuance of a permit. And the company that got denied the permit challenged it. And the court said, no, they can deny the permit because it's going to cause us ecological damage. And based on our right to human, and they don't have an environmental provision in their constitution, based on the right to human dignity and the right to life, this sort of integrated way of reading both of those rights together, we recognize this environmental, an environmental right. The constitutional text is really helpful. It's really valuable to have that text in the Constitution to give an anchor to judges who want to move in that direction. But we also see cases where it's not necessary because the judges are doing it through these other provisions. So maybe should we pause here and invite questions and conversation and discussion?
Sounds good to me. Nita, how does that sound to you?
Yeah, if you're ready, I know I certainly have a lot of questions. This is wonderfully exciting, and before I jump into my questions, let me turn to the group and see if anyone you want to raise your hand and see if you have any questions that you would like to pose, or while you are collecting your thoughts on the questions. Jimmy, and Erin, on the one hand, this is tremendously exciting. And on the other hand, it's a little bit disappointing. Here we have an incredible resource, and an incredible spiritual and legal resource to be able to promote human dignity and environmental health, which of course is the foundation of human dignity, as you're saying. And yet, Jimmy, you say that only about, 20 countries around the world of the 83 that have environmental human rights in their constitutions, in fact, bring cases based on them. Do you know why? And do you see a trend? Because I'm sort of discerning a trend. Do you see a trend where, in fact, environmental human rights wrapped up in human dignity is growing, and there's a greater activism around them over the past few years?
That's a double yes, I think, if I remember your questions correctly. So taking those in reverse order, yeah, there's a trend here linking human dignity and the environment. Especially over the last 10 years, there are cases from leading courts all around the globe, and from every continent. I mean, really every continent. In South America, there's a leading case in Colombia recognizing the legal personality of the Amazon. There's another case that protects one of the most important water bodies, sort of like the Chesapeake Bay of Colombia, the Rio Atrato. And there are cases in Nepal and Bangladesh and India and Pakistan and elsewhere that are recognizing, in essence, something that we might call a right to a healthy environment. The common thread throughout all those cases, and there are cases in in Africa and elsewhere, in Europe, the common thread is dignity. So courts are saying, hey, what's happening is an infringement on human dignity. So there can be, Nina, there's lots of disagreement about what to do, what it means to have a healthy environment, what even environment means, whether there's even a climate crisis. Some people contest that. But where there's common ground, I think, I don't know if Erin agrees with this, but maybe, but I think where the common ground is, again, is in dignity. So most people, most places, most courts, most cultures, most constitutions, and most continents, there's a general understanding of what dignity means, and that should be respected. And so when climate conversations occur, or right to a healthy environment conversations occur, it's harder to find common ground about whether there's a right to a healthy environment than there is about whether there's a right to dignity. And so that's why we see more and more jurisprudence on this trend. The first question was about environmental human rights. And I applaud efforts in Maryland and elsewhere to incorporate a right to a healthy environment in the Constitution, because constitutional instantiation makes for durable law, makes it less likely that a law will be changed, and more likely that it will become a normative part of conversations in society. That we see that everybody has a right to a healthy environment. 20 years ago, there wasn't any talk of that anywhere, or virtually, and now it's very common. But there are few cases, Nina, to answer your question. There are still few court decisions construing those kinds of provisions, and the reason for that, to answer your question, is well, it's everything is a little complicated, so I'm simplifying, so forgive me. But in those countries that have recognized a right to a healthy environment, in the majority of the majority of context, is that they're not in enforceable provisions of the Constitution. So they're not enforceable. And in the countries that have placed those provisions in what are called the fundamental rights portions of the Constitution, like our Bill of Rights at the federal level and in the Maryland Constitution, of those countries that have done so, only few cases have been brought. So yeah, that's where we get into, like, we go from 83, less than half of those have those provisions in enforceable portions of the Constitution, and even of those that are, there are a few cases that are brought, and fewer decisions from courts. So yeah, it's a couple of handfuls. You could count on both hands the number of countries that have issued opinions from courts that are engaging a right to a healthy environment in a legal order. But the times are changing there, and as there's more recognition of what that right can do, there will be more judicial opinions along the way. The last thing I'll say on this is that I think anyway, it's hugely important for judges to engage the right to a healthy environment, because it's through that will develop a body of law. So when Nina, I don't know what your experiences are in testifying before state legislatures and just answering questions in general, but at least for me, early on, from anyone who's really paying attention to these kinds of questions, that's the question I get is, what does it mean? What does a healthy environment mean? And what we see in the dignity case is much more comfort about what dignity means. So maybe that's too much of an answer, Nina. Thank you.
Claire asks, should we be encouraged or law?
I'll jump in if you'd like. I think it's a great question. The question made me smile. Should we be encouraged or discouraged about anything that's going on in the US? I think that's sort of part of it. I think that, as the global legal world moves towards this consensus of, first of all, recognizing that the right to live is the right to live with dignity, that governments owe some obligation to their people to ensure that people can live a life with dignity, not just not do things that interfere with that, but in addition to that, also set the circumstances so that people can live with dignity. And as people understand that living with dignity includes living in a healthy environment and a stable climate, a climate that's capable of sustaining human life, I think that the arc is bending towards recognition of greater dignity in law. And when the work that we've been doing, not just academically, but also at Dignity Rights International and through the law school, has really been to sort of focus on different ways in which dignity, in which there's the potential for growth in the recognition of human dignity as a basis of law. A couple of years ago, the American Bar Association adopted a resolution affirming that dignity rights are the foundation of a just rule of law, and urging governments in the US and around the world to ensure that all branches of government affirm and promote human dignity. So things like that, I think, have they don't change the world at once, but they do have the potential to foster more conversation and to build a foundation for growth. So one case here, one case there, and then eventually you start moving forward.
Yeah, and one of the things that we did in response to learning about your work and Jimmy's work on human dignity is put in the draft of our language of our constitutional amendment, the phrase that as an aspect of human dignity, right, as a component of human dignity, everyone has a right to a healthful environment. So it does seem to me that foundational to the right to a healthful environment is that bedrock understanding that there is a birthright of human dignity. And what our amendment does is help peel apart some of the and previously maybe unidentified element of human dignity, which is a healthy environment and a healthful environment. And Erin, I love the the tripartite aspect of dignity. If I got it right, I'll have to go back and look at this again in the recording. But that we have a right to live in dignity, right? We have the right to be treated with dignity. But what I found absolutely most astounding and very powerful was the right to assert one's dignity, because I think that's also an element that the amendment speaks to, because to live in dignity and to be treated with dignity, absolutely essential, but they also can have a sort of paternalistic attitude toward it. I'm a government and I'm corporations and I'm going to allow you to do it. And what that third element does says that we have a right to assert our own dignity, says that we have a right to protect ourselves, to define what we believe is a right environment for us, to be part of the conversation, to be informed of what you're doing. And I think that's another component of what our amendment would do, all based on the bedrock of the right to, that birthright, right, the God-given right that we have to human dignity, as you said, that everybody is born with, and no one is born with more dignity, you know, than anybody else. So I absolutely see how these are not just interconnected, but sort of layered. Human dignity foundational, and then how do you express human dignity? And what we're elevating and highlighting is that without environmental rights, you cannot have a complete definition of human dignity. Does that sound right to you?
I think you absolutely nailed it. Yeah. Everything you said was, yeah, I don't have anything to add. I guess the only thing I'll just add is just to make explicit something that I think you were saying, but that dignity has both a substantive quality to it, like how we live, how we experience life, how we experience our own identity and our own existence in community with others and all that. But also this participatory or procedural aspect, which is, as you say, the right to engage in conversations, the right to be at the table, the right to have a voice, and the right to have that voice listened to and heard. And that obviously extends to all the communities within a particular place that are concerned in various ways with the environment. So those two aspects, I think, are really, really important to a full understanding of dignity. And I guess just because I just mentioned it, there's another part of this that I want to just highlight, which is that particularly in the United States, one of our sort of national characteristics is our commitment to individualism. And there's a sense in which that notion of asserting one's dignity is about asserting your identity and your agency over things, and you can make decisions that are right for you. And frankly, like a lot of the same-sex marriage cases around the world, including in the US, are based on that notion of be the person that you want to be and flourish and have control over that. And that's all wonderful. But what's also an aspect of dignity is that it's not just an individualistic quality, that to live with dignity is to live in community with others and to be a part of a community. And the dignity jurisprudence around the world really recognizes that. And so, and in fact, the whole, the rights of nature movement also is part of expanding who is at the table, right? And who is part of the community that we listen to, not just other people, not just other generations, but also other parts of our ecosystems. So thanks.
Thank you. That was great. Before I turn to John, Jimmy, do you want to weigh in at all?
Yeah, no, go ahead. I think John's asking about the language, but yeah, I mean, I just want to point out something about the JUliana case.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. So we'll go to John, then you'll come back to JUliana. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So John asked, where may I find a copy of the proposed constitutional amendment? I can send it out to everyone here. And so it is, as you say, proposed. We are still gathering responses back and reactions. So if you have something to suggest about it, that would be great. So we'll send it out to everyone who is here. So yes, Jimmy.
Okay, so two things. One about JUliana, and the other that we'd be remiss not to talk, I think, a little bit more about is what does this mean for Maryland? So on the JUliana case, if you're thinking about the role that dignity can play, the plaintiffs there, Our Children's Trust, incorporated dignity into their claims that the federal government had failed to uphold its obligations under the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, and also something called Public Trust Doctrine in the United States. So the plaintiffs did that for the reasons Erin mentioned, is that there's this burgeoning jurisprudence around dignity, including in the United States, and especially in the Obergefell decision by Justice Kennedy. Now, he's no longer on the court, but that's the same-sex marriage case. And in reaching the conclusion, he said, look, this case is really about human dignity. It's that everybody possesses the same degree of dignity, as Pastor Nina mentioned. It's a birthright, and that the government doesn't have a right to tell people whom they can marry and people they love. And that's an extension of dignity, which is incorporated into the US Constitution. So we'll see where that goes. And getting back to the earlier question about should we be encouraged or discouraged, at least for me, I don't know yet. but as a litigator, this gets me to the second point to make about what it means for Maryland. So I was a federal civil litigator in environmental cases for almost 20 years, and I never couched a claim in human dignity in all that time. It just didn't occur to me. It hadn't occurred to me. You know, the kind of the typical, I think, descriptive of a US lawyer is they're US focused. And we don't have a tradition in the United States of looking outward. Some countries do. In some countries, you have to, like in South Africa, the Constitution of South Africa requires courts to look outside. And we, you know, like Erin mentioned, you know, as a laugh line, but it happened. It's true that, you know, sometimes when courts look outside, it's viewed as an impeachable offense. But getting back to Maryland and how to, how to operationalize a right to a healthy environment, a way to do that is with the assistance of dignity. And that's where these cases come in, and that's where this law comes in. You know, so as a litigator, as a lawyer trying to uphold these rights, you have to look at law. You have to look at what courts have done. And as I mentioned earlier, with a right to a healthy environment, there's not much there. You know, Pennsylvania leads the way internationally, you know, and you know, the whole omniverse again, most of the cases that have addressed this right to a right to really to hold the environment in trust, most of those cases are about, they're from Pennsylvania. But even in Pennsylvania, the cases by and large are not about a right to clean water or right to fresh air and so on. That's found in the first clause of Section 27 of Article 1 of the Pennsylvania Constitution. So there are a few cases on that side. There are tons of cases on the dignity side. So if it were me, and if I were trying to enforce a right to a healthy environment as an extension of human dignity, I just have much more footing having that word dignity there. And courts have much more, sort of a, jurisprudence to turn to in justifying a decision as to what human dignity means for the environment and vice versa. So that's why I like the idea, not just as a conceptual matter, as a normative matter, as a matter of morality or anything else, but just as, the nuts and bolts of it, trying to make a provision that's workable. It helps to have dignity there. Erin, what are your thoughts about that? Again, maybe that's saying too much.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. What we see, I mean, part of the reason it's fun to do this work is just because you're just in this giant sort of park of looking at all these cases from all around the world and seeing how every court is dealing with the same fundamental issues, but in different ways and in different language. And as we see sort of this coalescing. So I agree, but I don't have anything to add beyond what Jimmy said.
And one thing that I could add, just to edit myself, that's part of, it's a preoccupation of mine, but is that in some courts, dignity is the thing that it's interpreting. Courts are engaging dignity and trying to make it matter for the environment and for the rights of children and for future generations. And so it's really inspirational. So getting back to the question earlier about discouraged or encouraged, you're looking at these cases, they just read like they're like no cases in the United States yet read, really engaging what it means to be a human being and the role of the government and promoting joy. The other thing to make a mention of is that a constitutional recognition can also pave the way for legislative action, additional legislative action. For my money, I think Maryland should also think very carefully about enacting two pieces of legislation. One is about environmental impact assessment, to have a state environmental impact assessment law like 7 other states do, but Maryland doesn't. And the other is environmental justice. So there's also a link, of course, between environmental justice and dignity, and legislation can bridge that gap. And in some states, about a dozen states or so, more and more states are doing that. And the last comment on that is that the American Bar Association just earlier this year, a couple of months ago, issued a resolution on environmental justice that's supposed to be followed by its more than 400,000 members. It's the hugest, it's the largest legal association on the planet. And it's based in dignity again. So environmental justice, the idea of promoting environmental justice for the ABA is specifically to advance human dignity. So there we have that further imprint from, again, the largest legal association on the planet.
And what I'll jump in and say, I'm sorry, but Jimmy said that the ABA passed this in sort of passive voice. Jimmy spearheaded that effort. So that should be on the record too. But I think also a lot of what he's saying is also responsive to the question in the chat, because it is about this recognition that substantive and procedural rights reinforce each other. So you have to have opportunities for participation, you have to have information, you have to have citizen engagement in order to protect these substantive rights to live a life with dignity in a healthy environment.
I mean, this is incredibly helpful because you're right, Jimmy. Courts are going to have difficulty figuring out how to define the words that we put in an environmental human rights amendment. What is clean air? What is clean water? Right? What is a healthy environment? But knowing that they are all based on and spring from the right to dignity, I think it's one of these gut things, even more than a legal thing. One knows if that environmental degradation is impacting someone's human dignity, that I think could be determinative of how, the court might move. Even if, I mean, I hate to bring it up, it's like that pornography thing, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Human indignity when you see it. When you're compromising people's that tripartite element of human dignity, Erin, that you were talking about, right?
I think that's what's so interesting about dignity is that in our constitutional culture, the courts really shy away from these broad terms that they can't define. And what's been so fascinating is seeing that other courts around the world are not shying away from it. They are engaging there through the course of the development of the common law, one case after another, giving meaning to it. So when we say it's about the equal and inherent and inalienable worth of every person, that really just comes from reading the cases, that seems to be what they're talking about. There's an aspect of dignity that's about empathy, like as you say, Nina, like as a gut matter. It just means I should treat you the way I would want to be treated, right? And so when you can look at a landfill or you look at a polluted river, you think, would I want to live there? No. If it's not good enough for the decision makers, it shouldn't be good enough for anybody else. And in a way, that's the essence of sort of that aspect of dignity also, that does give it content.
And I think that gives us a way to measure it.
Right.
Would you want this? It's, from my perspective, from the Bible, love your neighbor as yourself. Would you want to be that person? Would you live there?
Yeah, it's not very formally legalistic, but I think that's exactly what's going on in so many cases. And when these cases say, what does it mean to live a life with dignity? That's how clean your air should be, is so that you can live with dignity and breathe normally. Well,
this has been so wonderful. And we, as I said, we are recording it. We're going to be sharing it widely. We're going to be using it. We're going to be developing clips from it. This is going to be really a powerful tool for us to help advance the understanding of our Environmental Human Rights Amendment. So with the last 2 minutes, Jimmy, let me throw it over to you if you want to say any final words.
Well, first, just again, thank you, Nina. Thank you, Clara. Thanks everyone for just listening in. And giving us your time, your most valuable commodity. And getting back to what we just were talking about common themes and being treated the way you'd like to be treated. Things happen that affect people and affect the environment, and dignity oftentimes is overlooked. Isn't thought of, but it can be a way of figuring out what to do about things. The example that comes to mind for me is the contamination of drinking water in Flint, Michigan. So again, as a former litigator, and many of you are policymakers, you think, okay, what should the law be? how clean is clean? What should we guarantee? How did this happen? What to do? There are all those questions. But really, if we begin with just asking whether the situation advances human dignity, or how to have the response protect human dignity, it helps strip away all that other noise and just focus on outcomes. And I see Flint, Michigan as an example of that. But it could be applied to just about any environmental issue, including those that the Maryland Environmental Rights Amendment proposal aims to address, to promote clean air, clean water, and so on. And that's really ultimately to advance human dignity, is my thought on it.
It's just wonderful. Thank you again, both of you, Erin and Jimmy, for this
Thank you.
wonderful presentation. For those of us who were interested, we can also share some of the bibliographic information so that those of us who are intrepid in those waters can sort of dive in. But this has just been wonderful. We can't thank you enough. Thank you for all your work, your continuing work. We continue to rely on your scholarship to support us and inspire us. So thank you so much.